Welcome. Incredible. This is so impressive to see this room full of people. Thank you very much for joining us in the Festival 42. It's great to be able to listen to these authors. It's really wonderful. Thanks very much to this festival, to the organization for having us and for having actually this very interesting roundtable. We will try to get into the title, this juvenile young adult fantasy party. Actually, what it really matters is the fantasy party. And we want to celebrate fantasy genre for young adults, for young children, for grown-ups. Because at the end of the day, it's about imagining worlds. And we have here 5 people that have really proven that they can imagine not one, but plenty of worlds with very different characteristics. Of course, there are some common denominators, but there's also a lot of differences. And this is what fantasy allows us to do. So to celebrate fantasy literature for young adults and not only, we are very happy to have all of them here. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. So I'm sorry, I apologize if I mispronounce your names and if I mix up all the titles, then so sorry. I'll try not to. So let me start by Manlio Castagna.
Sorry, but I don't.
Okay.
So I nodded all the time, but I didn't understand the thing.
Well, I just was
okay,
saying
okay.
thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
For you and for them.
Yeah.
And just, well, this idea of fantasy party.
Perfect.
This one, you understand it, no?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, I will begin with you, okay?
No.
No? No?
No,
Okay,
please.
well then,
A lot
okay.
of women, a lot of people that speak very good English, so I'm the worst
Okay,
one.
then we will begin by the other
I can enter in
place.
the party.
You probably... Well, ai, què fa? Ja començo, perdoneu.
I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up with languages. So we will start with Samantha Shannon. I don't know if you know her from her previous books or from current books. It was really, really surprising with the Bone season. We were all very much surprised with the book. Now we have the Priory of the... No, we have the Mime Order. That would be the second book. And now the Priory of the Orange Tree. And it's really amazing, epic fantasy, feminist fantasy with dragons. But dragons, and this is actually what I loved most, is that we have Western dragons, fire dragons, but then we have other types of dragons. Dragons coming from Eastern, Oriental myths and legends. They are water and air dragons. We will talk about it. My brain is already mispronouncing. It's not Olivier, Olivier. And in Spanish, we can read from her Atlas 6 and also Atlas Paradox, which came out recently. And it opens up like 6 a new fantasy, new world. We have 6 youngsters, and they master different powers. We have Alexandrian society, we have a library, we have different magics, but there's also a fight of power and also a battle, but also like a dilemma to talk about knowledge. And here we will maybe have the thing of labels. Is this for grown-ups? Is it for youngsters, for young adults? Just if you feel that you want to get into the books, then just feel free. Apart from that, she has, for example, My Mechanical Romance, and this would be more for young adults, and other titles. Sorry, I wasn't able to. I don't want to mix things. Okay, so let me read it. Annabel Steadman, and she has the Scander and the Unicorn Thief. And this is actually one of the questions. Was it a reaction to these fluffy unicorns that well in the showcases and the and all the toys shops? But your unicorns are slightly different. They are not only light. Your unicorns are not only light. Here on my side, I have Rebecca Ross. And Rebecca Ross is being translated into Spanish for quite a long time. We have The Queen's Rebellion. And this year we have River Enchanted and also Dreams Lie Beneath. And they have also this magic, legendary world. Almost a little bit of a fairy tale, but actually it's a beautiful mix. We have magic, we have spirits, we have music, with the possibility of someone singing could be able to communicate with spirits. And now let me turn to Manlio Castagna. He is not only a writer, and let me mention it, he's an artistic director of the Film Festival of Gifoni. Yes, Gifoni. And the jury, listen to it, the jury are young adults and children that decide which are the winning films. So beautiful job. Also to get in touch with readers and with also young viewers. We know him by the trilogy of Pietra Demone, would be the demon's stone, and the last book is Il destino dei due mondi, the destiny of the two worlds. So you see how full the room is. It's packed, so we can start celebrating this fantasy, this literature that you contribute to. And the first question, and I'm sorry to repeat and for being so ordinary, but where does this fascination, this interest, this passion for fantasy come from? This fantasy, where does it come from? And each of you addresses it from a different point of view as well, from a mythical point of view, or magic point of view, or legendary point of view. So why did you choose fantasy and not realistic novels? Just feel free to start. When we have a lot of people, it's the problem who starts, who breaks the ice. Oh, come on, don't leave me alone.
Yay, sorry. There might be a delay, I think.
Okay.
Staring at you like,
Yeah.
I'm talking, so I guess I'll keep talking.
Okay.
So for me, with the Atlas trilogy, I wanted to start with this idea of the world is dying. Where could I have gotten that idea from? So it's not that fantastical. But I wanted to play with this world where I was really looking at the effects of climate change, but in a way that maybe we would have solved some problems. So my concept was, what if in the setting, magic was a renewable resource, but also we were still operating within the constraints of capitalism, so it's very expensive. Not everyone has access to it. I'm American, so for example, healthcare is an issue because even if we could cure diseases, it would cost way more than a person could afford. So it was kind of expanding on the issues that we already had, and that was part of my ethical question of what do you do with knowledge and power when those things aren't evenly distributed. So it is still, it's not as fantastical as some of these other stories that I think use magic to solve problems. But I was also coming from a place where I think even if you look at like the COVID vaccine, for example, it almost feels magical. And so people say it doesn't exist, right? That it doesn't work. So these same questions, I wanted to have the feeling like we were in a world that was magical, but still had a lot of the same problems.
Okay. Yeah, and I think for me, for children, like fantasy is a really helpful tool to kind of give them an amazing story in a fantastical world, but also show them ways that they might cope with the similar problems in their own lives. And I think for Skandar, I wanted to set it in a world that's very similar to ours, but with the really small difference that unicorns are real and deadly, and they live on an island off the coast. I mean, I think that's pretty small. And like, how would we cope with that? Like, how would we cope with this fantastical, mythical creature being really different to how we thought, and also actually real? And like the answer in Skandar's world is we give the children an exam, because that's what we like to do, to test whether they can bond with a unicorn, whether they're destined for a unicorn. So it was fun to play in that space of what if this was real, and also because it feels maybe like it's set now and kind of in a possible future, I would say. Well, not possible, but who knows? And like I like those questions of like, what if this was true? And it needs to feel real enough so that then also children are asking questions about maybe their emotional experiences as well as the fantastical ones.
I might as well speak because I've started speaking. I think, yeah, I agree. I think that for me, the reason I'm drawn to fantasy is because it is the genre that is theoretically without any limits. You know, technically, if you write a contemporary or historical, you are bound by the laws of reality to a certain degree, whereas with fantasy, you can think outside the box, you can destroy the box. And I love, that's really exciting for me. The only limit is your own imagination. So I think if I were to try writing a contemporary, I would probably want to, you know, it would only be so long before I wanted to add a giant or some mythical creature. I think it just is what I'm drawn to. I just love the possibilities of it. I'll obviously talk later about that. I don't specifically write for children, but I think the great thing about fantasy is that it does have such a wide appeal. And I think it was Tolkien, like when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, he was testing the theory of whether or not the fairy tale was an adult genre in a way, because, you know, he wrote The Hobbit for his children, but as his children grew older, he found that he developed the story into The Lord of the Rings, and that I think he loved the fact that The Lord of the Rings became as famous as it did, because it proved to him that fairy tales and fantasy were not solely a domain for children.
Can I? I think my fascination for fantasy came from school, because I was very bad at school. Oh. Very bad. So I invented a lot of stories to try to go ahead, and I was pretty good to invent the stories. And after that, I tried to bring my friends together, girls, because I love the girls a lot. So I invited the girls and boys to my home, and I invented the fantasy stories, a lot of dark fantasy story, because in general I love this kind of fantasy, pretty dark, pretty happy, not happy, the contrary of happy, but okay, the dark side of the fantasy. So, for example, I bring these people to my home, and I invented this story where people are in the story, and a lot of them died, and the other one has to guess who's the how to say, the guilty. Okay. Yeah. So from that, I build my imaginary world full of things, full of deaths, full of a dark atmosphere. Sorry for my English. I know it's terrible, but I'm Italian, so you can understand. You can understand. For me, it's so difficult. And how Annabel said, I think it's very true. It's a tool. You can use the genre as a tool for to tell your story. And for Petrademone, for Piedra del Demonio, I wanted to tell the story of a girl who lost his parents, and the last desire is to meet them for another time, for the last time. So how to bring this this girl to a world where the people can live beyond the death? So fantasy was my my tool, my chance to tell this kind of story. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, and just echoing what everyone else has said, I grew up reading fantasy books. So I grew up on the Chronicles of Narnia. I love them so much that I have this memory of like sitting in the closet, just like hoping it would open up into Narnia because I wanted to experience it so bad in real life. And then as a teenager, I fell in love with Lord of the Rings. So I was obsessed with the books, also the movies. But I remember when I was reading that book, like I wanted to be part of the Fellowship again, like so bad. And all of the characters in the Fellowship are men. And so I was like, well, you know what? I will just have to sit down and write my own worlds and my own characters and write the story where I feel like I am involved in the magical quest. So, but yeah, I think it really just began with my love of reading fantasy books, and spent a lot of time as a teen, again, writing stories by hand that have never seen the light of day. But it was just a way for me, I think, to just let my imagination go, because I've always had a very vivid imagination too.
Esperarem una mica perquè llavors ells, bueno,
Should we wait? Because actually you have to wait till I talk, and they have to wait for the translators to finish. So big confusing everything. I have a series of questions, and a lot of things have come up, and now let me go back to some of the points you've mentioned, talking Lord of Rings, fantasy as the tool, that fantasy also as the freedom to create worlds and to deal with series of topics that are ageless, that are timeless. So this is actually the good thing on fantasy, that you can reach a lot of people, a lot of ages, a lot of places. And now, let me digress. I have a nephew, 10 years old, has read Lord of Rings, and he starts writing now. Beautiful, no? To be able to create things. And I know that in your cases, you don't write for children or for teenagers, so you have this, we have this crossover from 12, 14 till 90. And this is actually the good thing of your books. But my question would be, and you sort of said it, but is fantasy a good way to get into reading? So that young, not children, okay? No, I'm not referring to children, but for bit older children to get in love, not only to fantasy, but to get in love with literature, with this possibility. Because what you're doing now is offering possibilities for imagination.
I like to think of fantasy as a way to hide the medicine. So that when you're in this magical world, you're still telling a story about the world. It's like looking at the world through a mirror. Where you don't have to necessarily confront your day-to-day life, but you're still talking about things that are significant. And with the age thing, so the Atlas series is for adults, but I don't think of that as an age, it's more of the type of story. So for young adults, you're telling a coming-of-age story, that you're finding yourself in the world. I think that hero's journey really works or the chosen one narrative works really well when you're a teen, because you're just figuring out how you fit in, how you want the rest of your life to look, and you're just beginning this journey. Whereas when you're writing for, technically adult, it's more about these bigger themes. That's when you get like the political fantasies or more of the interpersonal conflict. And so for me, when I'm deciding who is this book for, it's writing, which theme am I writing for? But I love that having it in this magical world that allows you to escape a little bit means that you could read it at any point. You're just looking for what mood, like who is that main character, and which part of you are they speaking to?
Yeah, I think fantasy books can be a really good way to get into reading. I think if I've been in a reading slump, you know, and I don't know what to read next, I often go for fantasy books, or new ones or ones I've read before. And I think maybe that's for me personally, but maybe other people, because it's escapism. You know, often we pick up a book because we don't want to see what's in front of our face. We don't want to see the news. We don't want to see what's going on, and we might kind of see it in an almost subconscious way when we're reading, and like maybe we'll sort out some of those issues or that we're having, or we see something reflected in that fantasy book. But I think for me, the escapism is part of, like, it gets you into reading, and then you almost forget that you're reading. Mm-hmm. So I think if you're struggling, then fantasy is a good way in to kind of remind yourself like how magical reading is.
I agree with both of those points. I think that, I mean, I know that fantasy can potentially be overwhelming for some readers because there's so much detail. You have to familiarize yourself with a completely new world. For me, I agree with Annabel about the escapism. That's exciting for me. It does take me away from the horrors of the real world, like even if you're escaping into the horrors of a different world. So for me, it is very accessible, and I think that definitely applies to young people as well. I also agree with Olivia's point about it being a good engine for sort of exploring themes, because I think one risk when you set out to explore a theme in a book, there is a risk that you can come across as quite didactic and preachy. Mm. And I think that fantasy is a good way, like you say, to kind of almost conceal your intentions and to explore the subject in a way that is interesting and exciting. And it just allows you, for me, it's more about sort of prompting the reader to think about these things rather than putting your specific point across. It's more like me posing questions to the reader that they can then answer for themselves. And in terms of like the age question, it's an interesting one because the definition of young adult is quite nebulous. I think officially speaking, there's an American classification system that sort of says it's about characters or for readers who are roughly between the ages of 12 and 18, which is a huge age gap. I mean, there's books that I would give, you know, an 18-year-old I would not want to give a 12-year-old. And then it becomes even more interesting because if you look at something like A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, many of the characters in that book are very, very young. I think Arya is like 11 or something, and then like sort of even the older Stark characters are quite young in the book. But I don't think anyone would classify that book as YA. No. Whereas like my book, The Priory of the Orange Tree, one of the characters is 64, so significantly out of the YA age range. In fact, all of the main characters are out of the YA age range. The nearest one is a character who's 19, who's kind of borderline YA. But interestingly, several countries, including Spain, have published it as young adult. And for me, I very much wrote it as an adult book, but I've generally let the countries choose for themselves where to place it because I don't know the audience as well as they do. So it's an interesting question that we're all kind of trying to define something that is difficult to define.
Please, Rebecca. Sorry.
Yeah, I love everything they said. It just answered so perfectly. I know I started off in young adult, so The Queen's Rising was my debut, and it was young adult, the coming of age story. And 5 books later, I am trying to write A River Enchanted, and I just assumed that I was going to write a young adult novel again, like my other books. And my inspiration for the book was I first saw The Island, so it was the first time that the setting called to me first. Usually my books are inspired by characters. It's like a lightning bolt of inspiration of a character, and I start asking questions. But this time it was the island, and so I had to ask myself, like, who are the people who live here on this magical island? And the funny thing was, the first 2 characters that I saw were Torin and Sidra, and they're in their late 20s. They have a marriage of convenience. Torin is like this gruff, captain of the guard, and then Sidra is this tender-hearted healer. And I saw that they were having some type of discussion where they both were coming from two very different viewpoints on it. And I was like very intrigued by them, but I knew, I was like, well, you know, they're in their late 20s and they're dealing with themes like marriage and faith, and like, I just wasn't sure yet. I was like, I'm still looking for my young adult protagonist. So I then found Adara and Jack. And so as I began to write the story using Jack as like the main character, I had him at 18 years old to begin with. And as I'm writing this book, I'm sending it chapter by chapter to my critique partner, Isabel Ibanez, and like literally by chapter 3, when she read Sidra's first chapter, she sent me a text and she was like, is this young adult or adult? And I was like, oh, okay, so the fact that you have to ask me this probably means it's for adults, and I don't even realize that I'm like, doing that at that point in time. So I was like, you know what, I'm not sure what it is yet. Let me just because I discovery write so much, I was like, let me just keep writing this and see what happens and see where I'm at by the end of the book. Surprisingly, Torin and Sidra, their story arc, I just fell in love with them. So they were ended up being very involved with the story. And so by the end, I did feel like I had a 50-50 split between YA and adult, and it was like this very weird thing to look at. And I just I think though is that young adult was very familiar to me and what I know really well because I'd already written 4 other young adults books. But then I could tell that I was hungry to start writing about older characters, touching on themes that I hadn't yet touched upon in my young adult. So I was like, I just need to gain my confidence and let myself truly go and write this as adult. And so once I made that distinction, I was able to go back through and revise it, and with the adult in mind, and again, just what they were saying, the themes that I'm touching on, and even just the tone of the storytelling, I think is different. And so it was very interesting, just how that book, it was this very organic way of almost me kind of having to grow outside of my comfort zone even, and challenge myself. So very interesting how that happened. But I do think it's interesting because some people will ask me why is this adult versus YA? And I think it can still be very hard for some people, or sometimes Irreverent Change will still get classified as young adult even though it is adult. And I know I have a lot of teen readers who read up, so it really kind of comes down to your preference or your comfort with reading level. Some teens don't really want to read adult yet, while others do. And then there are a lot of adults who also like reading young adults, so there's a lot of crossover sometimes.
So they said all the intelligent things, so I have to. I just can tell 3 facts, not very intelligent, but they explain how fantasy is for me. My last book is a horror for adults, so it's not about this book. It's about Petrodemon. It's for kids, for middle grade people. And the first one was something that changed my life forever from a kid. I wrote the first Petrodemone, the first, La Piedra del Demonio. And this kid sent me a direct to Instagram because I have this interaction with all my readers by Instagram. And he said, I really hate literature, but I found Petrodemon, and now, I don't know, I'm shackling, I'm very... if you don't write the second book, I write for you. No, it's okay, I have to write. They pay me for writing. But it's not the message I want to talk about. But the second message came some months before the second book was released. And he told me this thing through direct. 1 hour and a half, my mom died. And now I want one thing in my life, to stay with your character, Frida, under the tree. The tree is the door for another world. And for me it was incredible because this guy lost his mom I'll just say, 1 hour before, so it was incredible for me. And this is the first idea I had about fantasy as a bridge between who write and who read, and a bridge to overcome some of the obstacles the kid sometimes has. And the other 2 things are about the 2 kids I met. I had a lot of a meeting with the school in Italy to talk about my books. And I always ask to these kids, how do you like fantasy? So one said, because reality is really boring. So he understood everything about her life. And fantasy is a way for me to explore other worlds. Perfect. The second one was a girl, and she said, I read fantasy because when I read this kind of a book, I feel more adult. I feel bigger. And for me, it's another key to understand what is fantasy, or horror as well. It's a way to feel more adult. Thank you very much.
No, it's...
Interesting, everything you said so far. The idea of the golden age of juvenile literature. And there's this dilemma that you already mentioned. First thing, as an author, maybe you know that you want to write for children, 8 years old, or 12 years old, or from 16 on. Maybe you're clear with that. But maybe you don't have a plot. Maybe you don't have a story. Or maybe you do have a story, and you can only point it to a specific direction, and then it grows, and it can gather more readers. What is your process? You have the story, and then you think about the age? I don't know. You were talking about the age of characters. Also very interesting. This is something that happens here in our country. I don't know if you also had this experience in your countries and in other countries. Maybe there's this prejudice. Oh, this is juvenile, this is just for teenagers. Oh, this character is so young. I'm a grown-up. I'm not interested in that. This was totally broken with this prejudice, was totally broken with Harry Potter, but there's still a prejudice, a little prejudice, but still there. Do you think that the age of characters can determine the readers that you are going to have? You said so, and you have in River Enchanted some older characters, but also younger characters, so you reach both. So do you bear in mind the age of your characters? And it depends also on what you said, Samantha. Depending on the country, where is it classified as a teenager, or as an adult, or children? There's actually an age where you have to be careful, of course, but after a certain point, then it doesn't have to be controlled.
If you want, I can.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's easier for me. So I can say the stupid things than they say the interesting things. Okay. In general, when I come up with the idea, I don't think about the age of my readers. I try to tell a good story, a story for everyone in general. Mm-hmm. But at a certain point, the story take another direction, and I have to consider if my publisher is a middle grade or young adult publisher or an adult, because I have different publisher in Italy. And you have boundaries. In general, you have two kind of boundaries in Italy. I don't know in Spain, I don't know in America, in England, but are sex and bad words. So you can use all the kind of violence. You can kill a lot of people in your books, but they don't have sex. I don't have to say merda, vaffanculo, ciao, fuck you. You can say this. I know when I say vaffanculo, I feel like El Padrino, you know, father. I feel like something very mafia style English. And about the prejudice, I think there is a lot of prejudice in Italy. I talk about Italy. When you have when you say people, I wrote books for young people or for kids. Ah, okay, for kids, great. And they read other books. And when in your story there is a teenager or a young character, it's immediately labeled as a kids or teenager books. And in the bookshop, you come up in the end of the bookshop, in the very end, in the dark side, where people can go very easily. This area is the area for kids and young people, and it's strange. It's a sort of a cave. Yeah, you are in the cave of the bookshop, and it's about the prejudice. Now the things are a little bit changed because of TikTok. Because in Italy, TikTok has changed everything. Here as well?
Yeah, here as well.
She's a TikToker. She knows, yes, TikTok, yeah, of course, yeah. And thanks to TikTok, a lot of books for young people are now very big in Italy. And in the bookshop, there is a shelf, TikTok advice. So a lot of people comes there and take the books. They don't know what kind of books are, but they go there. And a lot of books are for young people and for example, there is a book of Samantha. I remember there. Sorry?
Glad to hear it.
Yeah. So my goal in life is go there in the TikTok shelf. So please, in Spain, if you want. Yeah, Petrademole and Book Talk. Thank you very much. So.
So I remember when I wrote my first book, The Bone Season, La Era de Huesos. I actually, when I sent it to the man who became my agent, I said I don't really know who this is for because the character was 19. And that's a bit of an awkward age because it technically falls outside the parameters of YA, but it's also not particular, it's literally just 1 year above. And in contemporary, that's a bit easier to distinguish because, a 19-year-old character would be having, going to college or moving out for the first time. Whereas in a fantasy novel, the differences weren't quite so profound. And I ended up sending it to Bloomsbury, which is my UK publisher, and they decided it was adult, but I think a different editor might have decided it was YA, because in a way it is a fairly classic coming-of-age story, or at least the first one is. So that was interesting, and it did end up being published as YA in some countries and adult in others. For me, I don't particularly mind. I do make it clear that I don't write for children. That's another complication with YA, because YA falls under the general children's umbrella. And for me, it's a bit different saying I write for teenagers versus saying I write for children, because for me, I wouldn't describe my books as children's books. The content is not appropriate for children. I wouldn't give it to kids. But teenagers, often do read my work. I would describe much of my work as being crossover. It's interesting with YA as well, because I know that in the US, YA really exploded, and most YA, I imagine, does come out of the US, whereas in the UK, I don't feel like we ever really had that same explosion. And indeed, many US YA books are published in the UK as adults. So Laini Taylor's books, for example, they are YA in the US, in the UK they're not. And I wonder if that is because in the UK we perhaps have slightly more of a prejudice towards YA, perhaps it's considered more childish. And I think that can intersect with fantasy in interesting ways, because I think fantasy is another genre that has a degree of prejudice against it. I think it might have been Christopher Tolkien who said this. Sorry, I have a lot of Tolkien knowledge that I keep busting out. I think it was Christopher Tolkien talking about his father, and he explained that obviously when Tolkien was writing, fantasy was not it was not particularly common. He was one of the founding authors of fantasy, and Christopher Tolkien said people would think of fantasy as being like a deserter running from an army, because the idea is that you are running away from the realities of real life. And Tolkien took issue with this, and he said there are circumstances in which escape can be considered noble. So, for example, if someone is imprisoned and breaks out of a prison, that's considered more noble than the idea of defecting from an army. So I thought that was a really interesting case point about how fantasy gets treated. Some people will sneer at it and say that you're running away from the real world, you don't want to embrace reality. I definitely see it more in terms of how Tolkien saw it, with the idea that you're breaking free of the boundaries of reality. So yeah.
I think just because we're sadly American, I'm so sorry. I really am so sorry, just to everyone. I'm so sorry that I'm speaking English. I apologize for all imperialism. I do that in my book as well.
Imperialism, I need to apologize for.
That's your fault.
I'm the villain.
but I'm certainly, yeah, okay.
I apologize to you.
Thank you,
And all
and now I
Americans.
will. You guys have some of that too, though. I'm Filipino, so
Oh, gosh.
there's,
Sorry.
yeah.
Sorry.
Anyway, so actually, which is actually kind of relevant because I think part of the YA boom in the United States has a lot to do with identity. That especially when you're writing about teenage characters and you're already doing the self-discovery thing, you want to hear from your inner child. Like as a writer, I grew up always reading, the characters were always white, and they were often British.
Sorry.
And thank you. I accept all of these apologies. So when I was writing my young adult, which is My Mechanical Romance, it's under my real name, Alexine Farrell-Fulmuth, I was speaking directly to the teenager that I was, the teenager who never saw myself in books. And I think that happens a lot in fantasy as well, that all these sort of marginalized identities, we're never the chosen ones. And so, I think maybe demographic shift or whatever, I think that reading is more commodified now. I can't take my capitalism hat off. So I'm gonna keep talking about that. That like there are people buying teenage books, and so now publishing is like, how do we sell to teenagers? But I think that part of that is wanting to see yourself on the page, wanting to see the experience that we haven't seen in literature before, social media has really been helpful with that because it's still word of mouth. That's still the best way to sell a book, is to have someone read it, get really excited, and tell all their friends. But with Book Talk, they have way more friends.
Yeah,
and it's just crowdsourcing on a huge volume. And so I think that that's why sometimes people will look at the Atlas series and say, like, oh, these young people are reading it, and therefore it must be for young adults, whereas what it really is, yeah, we're gonna talk about these really complicated themes, but I'm also not trying to teach you anything about right and wrong. In fact, do not glean anything about right and wrong from the Atlas series. Do not do as they do or say. So I think for me, it's that like responsibility of who am I talking to. Fiction is such a driver of empathy that I think it would be irresponsible not to consider who the audience is and who you're telling a story for. Fairy tales, they're for all ages, but they're also teaching us something. There's gold in the fairy tale that you're digging for. There's no gold in Atlas.
I think it's interesting talking about the prejudice, I suppose, that, or almost like the fear that adults have sometimes. They're like, oh, I couldn't read the children's book. I think probably mine are the youngest here out of everyone, like the kind of 8 to 12, 12 to 14 space. Like my characters are kind of 13. But I get messages on social media saying, I'm a 56-year-old man and I really love this book, as if they're shocked. And I think at the end of the day, I didn't write it for children in the same way. At the beginning, I didn't set out to write a book for children. I felt like 13 was a kind of interesting age. And then as I kind of got into it, I started thinking about, obviously the swearing and the sex not going to happen. But it is also quite dark. And I mean, they're bloodthirsty unicorns. It's not kind of, there is kind of there are violent aspects to it in a kind of not entirely on screen way. But so you do have to start thinking about that a bit. But I think what's interesting about writing Scandar, the series, is they get older every year. So, they start 13 to 14. So by the time it ends, when there's 5 books, they're going to be 18. They're going to be at that point. So it's quite strange for me when people kind of are trying to put the first book in particular age category, or this is excellent for 9-year-olds. It's kind of well, so are you only going to let 12-year-olds read the third one? How are you going to carry on that categorization? Mm-hmm. And I think it's just people should just give themselves a break. They should be if you enjoy the story and you're an adult, enjoy the story, get what you want out of it, mm-hmm. and children will, they'll find it and they'll get what they want out of it as well. And I think, it is important as you say, like the publishing machine, they want to know who they're going to sell it to.
Yes.
But word of mouth does help with that, and you know, it's an interesting thing when children are kind of recommending to each other. And then, like, you know, the older sibling steals it or something. And, you know, that is like the author dream. Like, we all want that. Just taking each other's books to read. It's great.
And yeah, everything they just said was, I echo that. I will say I did have an experience in the US where the Queen's Rising had just come out, and I was doing a library event, and I had an adult come up to me and say, "When are you going to write a real book?" And I was just like, this is a real book, even though it is young adult. And so I just, you know, I was so shocked. I didn't realize, oh, you know, this, you know, just took me years of my time, blood, sweat, tears, whatever. But no, I do think it is a shame there is a bit of prejudice towards young adult, because I think there are some very powerful, moving stories in young adult that benefits everyone to read.
But I just say, from a craft perspective, YA is hard. You have to move at a much quicker pace.
Yes.
You have to keep a much like an audience that you might lose at any moment. You have to constantly keep them engaged, which is why I don't write YA fantasy, because I want to sit there and ruminate and philosophize, and I would bore a 15-year-old to tears probably. But yeah, that it's crazy to me that anyone would say that, because it's actually very difficult to write for young readers.
Yeah.
And there is another prejudice about capitalism, imperialism. In Italy, it's impossible for an Italian author to write a young adult book, because the young adult readers only read American and English books. So it's your fault. No,
Yes, again, sorry.
no, it's okay. And I take the chance to apologize for all the pizza and spaghetti invasion we did in the world. So. Sorry for this, and for mafia as well, but pizza and spaghetti more than mafia. Yeah, it's an invasion. Yesterday was in Barcelona, a lot of a pizza restaurant, a spaghetti restaurant, and for me it was a nightmare. All this Italian invasion, everything. So sorry.
Oh, but we have to thank you for Elena Ferrante, I used.
Yeah, but it's not a young adult.
I know, but I'm just thanking. I'm not worried about them.
Yeah.
Thank you for Elena Ferrante. There's these two physicists that did a lot of stuff I read for Atlas. Carlo Rovelli, Guido Tonelli. Like, the most amazing physics research is in Italy. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. But they don't write for young people. Okay, it's okay.
A veure, jo havia pensat en...
I was thinking about opening the floor for a discussion, but we're running out of time, because you told a lot of things, very interesting things. I really thank you for writing real books, okay? They're fantasy, but they're real books for YA, or the label you want to put on them. But I just recommend them. They're really beautiful. And this packed room is just a proof of that. Thank you very much for having us, for being here, for creating these stories, these worlds, these fantastic creatures and characters. Thank you for coming.
Sorry. Can I take a selfie? Okay. Because this incredible audience, my mother doesn't believe me. There is a lot of people in a room in Spain for my books, for my strange books. So can I? Thank you. All together is better.
Oh, God, okay.
Sorry, but... and try to make very exciting faces. So people believe.
I can take the photo for you.
Yeah, no, okay. As you want, as you want.
Yeah.
I'm trailing wires all over the place.
No, it's in...
Okay. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Ui,
Sorry, I've dropped all my wires.
Podeu baixar una miqueta els focus perquè es vegi la gent, sisplau?
Just a little bit.
Merci.
Oh, it's very
Should we
intimate.
bend down?
Ay, que me caigo.
God.
Ok. I think it's...
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.